was that woman. I was the woman who interrupted Jesus on his way to heal a little girl. I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, but I had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. I had done everything that I could. I'd spent all that I had, and it only got worse. The hardest part, though, was the bleeding made me unclean, and I was separated from everyone that I loved. I was beyond desperate. And then I heard that he was coming. I didn't dare approach him. I didn't dare approach anyone, but especially him. He was coming through our town, and he was surrounded by people. So many people. I don't know what got into me, but before I knew it, I was fighting through the crowd. In my desperation, I thought, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I would be healed. I knew he was that powerful. I reached, and I reached, and I was so close. And then I touched it. Just the hem. But immediately I felt his power surge through me, and I knew I was healed. I didn't even have time to fully experience the joy because he turned and he asked who had touched him. Even without seeing me, he knew what had happened. And his disciples were quick to point out that many in the crowd were pressing in against him, but he knew that this was a different kind of touch. This was a touch seeking healing and redemption. I'd fall to my knees, and I confessed to him what I had done. And instead of rebuking me, he told me to go in peace. In peace. Yes, I now have a peace and a joy that's beyond understanding. And I know that what Jesus did for me, he can do for that little girl. I just pray that he gets there in time.
Have you ever been in such a hurry, only to be surrounded by people who seem to be getting in your way or slowing you down? Well, it seems like I'm often in a hurry. But on this particular day, it was completely justified. You see, my daughter, my little girl, was very sick. And I was rushing to find Jesus. I just knew he could heal her. And when I found him, he agreed to come right away. But the crowd, there were so many people, it was impossible to move fast. And then this other woman stopped Jesus, asking to be healed. I knew the urgency of my own situation, and I was so frustrated that he would stop to help her. But he did. I mean, if she had enough strength to fight through those crowds, surely her situation wasn't as desperate as my daughter's. He must have known that. But instead, he stopped to heal her. And in the time it took, I received word that my daughter had died. I was devastated and frustrated that he had been interrupted on his way to heal my daughter. And then he looked at me, and he told me not to be afraid, to only believe. Believe what? That my daughter could have been healed but wasn't? I was overcome with so many emotions, and yet, somehow, maybe because of his compassion, maybe because I had no other hope, maybe because I could see in his eyes both the depth of my pain and the depth of his compassion, I did believe. When we got to my house, he sent everyone away. he took my little girl by the hand. And she sat up. She was alive. Oh, Jesus, I do believe. I do.
Two stories in one story. Two people whose encounters with Jesus intertwined. Two people who were very different from each other. He is a man. We're given his name, Jairus. A prominent person in a powerful position in the community. He was a ruler in the local synagogue. She is a woman, unnamed, likely largely unknown, and socially unclean because of her physical ailment. His request perhaps somehow tugs at our hearts a bit more. It's his little girl, 12 years old, we're told later in the story, and she is dying. If ever there was a cause for urgent response, if ever there was a cause for compassion, if ever there was something to melt our hearts, it would be his situation, her situation, his little girl. This woman, well, her plight is a little, actually makes us a little uncomfortable even to talk about it, especially in polite society, let alone to get close to her. Some form of constant bleeding that had been going on for 12 years, as long as the little girl had been alive. And yet, these two very different people from very different places with seemingly very different needs are very much the same where it matters. They're very much the same in their sense of desperation. This woman put it in very clear financial terms. She had suffered for 12 years. She had spent all that she had, and instead of getting better, she got worse. She had done everything she knew to do. We can imagine that Jairus had more resources at his disposal, perhaps better doctors than this woman could afford. But his little girl wasn't getting any better. And he actually used the term, she's dying. Pushing through all of the natural guards, the psychological, emotional guards that keep us from facing the truth about ourselves, about our circumstances. Oh no, maybe she'll get better. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe. Somehow her condition had forced him through all of that to face the reality that apart from some intervention, the unbelievable, the unimaginable, what a parent would fear the most, that he was facing the death, the loss of his little girl. Different and yet the same. So desperate. They were also the same in this little bit of hope. This little bit of hope, this little glimmer beneath and in the midst of all of that desperation, each of them had heard about this Jesus. And that little bit of hope was all it took to put them into action as they went to find him. Jairus reached Jesus first, poured out his heart. It says he fell at his feet and he pleaded earnestly, pleaded fervently. An urgency to his prayer, an urgency to his request, a sense of desperation. There's nothing held back here. A small group of us who met here for prayer yesterday morning talked about the call to this 40 days of prayer, purposefully, faithfully, together. There's one more word. What did I skip? Fervently. I don't know that I've ever prayed like this. We talked a little bit with what does it mean to pray fervently. This is fervent prayer. This is a fervent request. And I'm not suggesting that we put that on as we gather or as in our private times at home during the week as we pray for our church during these 40 days. But maybe it's something to look at. Is what does that mean? Where are the areas that in my own life I need to recognize my limitations? I need to recognize my lack of independence. I need to recognize my total dependence upon God. What is there in your life or in our life that we can't see a way for it to happen apart from God showing up? That becomes the pathway to a sense of fervency. And that's where this father was. If God doesn't show up, there is no hope. He falls at Jesus' feet, pleads fervently, "Please come. My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." It's interesting, I titled this sermon, "Yearning to Touch, Learning to Trust," because that kind of talks about the two different people in the story. But from the father, from Jairus' perspective, he was yearning for a touch too. Jesus, if you will only come and put your hands on her, she'll be healed. My daughter will live. We're not told whether Jesus said anything to him or not. Apparently the implication was clear. Maybe it was in Jesus' response to him. Maybe there were tears in his eyes. Maybe it was the way he just looked around, nodded, and set out. At some point, he wouldn't let the crowds come with him, but that, I'm getting ahead of myself. That comes in a few moments. We're told initially, so Jesus went with him. Jesus set out with him, and a large crowd followed. Had they heard this request? Had they seen it? Probably. There's no indication of Jairus coming and just saying, "Jesus, I got a little problem here." I don't see that at all. Maybe their hearts were touched. Maybe they thought, "Oh, wow, I got to see this." Whatever it is, Jesus clearly indicates his intention to come and to meet this need. They set out on the journey, the crowd following. Meanwhile, there was this woman who'd been fighting the crowd, pushing herself forward, trying to get close enough to touch even just the hem of Jesus' robe. And here's the picture in my mind. You know, Jesus is coming through town, so So imagine him walking, and I don't have anything to back this up other than just my imagination in this story, and that there's no indication of Jairus having to fight the crowd, so probably Jesus is coming this way, and the crowds are all kind of beside him and behind him, around him, but letting him lead, and Jairus is coming from this direction, so it's easy for them to connect, and meanwhile, there's this woman back here trying to fight through the crowds, and in the time that Jesus is still and talking to Jairus, maybe she's making some progress through the crowds, and then they start off again, and maybe she was just so close before they started again. I mean, you realize if they're moving in the same direction, you can't make as much progress. They start on their way, and maybe in even greater desperation, I've got to reach him before he gets away. She manages to touch his garment. It is a very dramatic story. Scripture says clearly that she was healed instantly. And the clear indication of this story is that she would have been really happy to have left it there. If the crowd had just continued moving and had passed her by, and she were left alone there in the street, whole and clean. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She wasn't trying to interfere with anything. She wasn't even trying to be noticed. In fact, was likely hoping not to be. Jesus stops immediately. He knows that something has happened. Verse 30 says, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Absurd. That's what the disciples thought. You see the people crowding around you, the disciples answered, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" Are you kidding? Everybody's touching, all of us. But Jesus knew. Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. One of the other gospel writers indicates that, this may have gone on for a little while, that people in the crowd said, "It wasn't me, it wasn't me." And it was such that this woman began to feel, I've got to confess. It says, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told the whole story. That tells something about where she's coming from in this. She'd been found, she'd been discovered. Everything in her background told her that this important person, even though she knew he was different than the others, that she had crossed a line she shouldn't have crossed. That now she was back, even though she was healed, she was still the powerless, she was still the woman in the story in that time. And here was this man. He had the power, she had none. Her best hope was to throw herself at her feet and to cry for mercy for this terrible thing she had done. Trembling with fear, she poured out her story. Jesus says to her, as I'm sure he lifts her to her feet, looks into her eyes, says, "Daughter." Think that's significant? Who's watching? Who's right there beside Jesus? Remember where this story got interrupted? You think Jairus heard that? Jairus, who's standing there with all of these conflicting emotions in his mind. Yes, it's nice, Jesus, that you're helping this woman, but she's already healed. Can't we move this on? And my daughter. Jesus' words to her, daughter. Jesus' love for this woman was no less than Jairus' love for his little girl. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Very next verse. While Jesus was still speaking. Remember, they're at the front of the pack, likely. Yeah, people are trying to see, but they don't know the way to Jairus' house. While he's still speaking, Jairus, eager to move on towards home, to get this thing moving again, to reach his daughter in time, looks down the road. He sees the messengers from home. He knows who they are. He recognizes them. Maybe for a moment, is she already... As they get closer, he doesn't need to wait for their words. Why would they come if something hadn't changed? And I'm sure it's obvious in their countenance. Their message, here's this word again, your daughter. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? I'm going to suggest that Jesus' love for Jairus, all throughout this, from the very beginning, including this moment, was no less than his love for the woman, and no less than Jairus' love for his daughter. He's kind of personal that way. Very much aware of the struggle going on in Jairus' heart. And my guess is there is more to this story than we know. That's the way God works. My guess is there were even deeper levels of trust and faith for Jairus to embrace. Maybe deeper levels of compassion for Jairus to begin living out. We don't know. We don't always know when God's timing doesn't seem to be our timing. But Jesus looks at him. In Mark, it says, ignoring what they said. Other gospel writers make it clear that Jesus heard, Jesus knew what the message was. He says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. Don't be afraid when you've just received news of your worst fear. Don't be afraid. At this point, Jesus stops the crowd. How he did it, I don't know, but turns around and says, okay, no further. I mean, those are my words now. It's far enough. This isn't about you anymore. Give us space. Respect what's going on here. This isn't a circus. This is personal. Jesus did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him. Similarly, Jesus creates space and privacy. He sends them all out of the house. He took the child's father and mother. Let's not leave her out of this story. While Jairus is going for help, she never leaves her daughter's bedside. She was likely there at the moment of her final breath. He took the child's father and mother, the disciples who were with him, and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up, began to walk around. She was 12 years old. The story filled with emotion. But what do we learn from this story? There's a lot of things we can take away. Jesus cares about women. You say, well, yeah, of course. But that was bigger news back then, perhaps, than it is today. Still needs to be said. Jesus also cares about what women and men care most about. Don't forget that part of the equation, even though the healing was of this little girl. The agony, the heartache, the desperation of her parents. Jesus cares about that too. And yes, Jesus cares about little girls, including the ones who were sitting up here earlier this morning. The ones part of our church family, the ones in our community, little boys too. We'll talk more about that in 3 weeks, when we have boys and girls up front here for We Folk Sunday. Jesus' power is not limited by time and space, by circumstances. He's in control. Jesus knows us individually. We are unique persons. We're not just the next one in line. He knows our burdens, our hurts, our heartaches, our fears. Fear of losing a daughter, the fear of having our story of being exposed. Jesus loves and cares about us more deeply than we realize. He loves and cares for the people who may seem to be the ones getting in our way more than we realize. They too are his daughters and sons. Jesus relates to us personally. He will relate to us personally if we dare to bring our burdens, our hurts, our heartaches, our fears, our desperations, and our hopes. If we dare to get close and personal with him. It's really what this series is all about. It's not just stories of people who encountered Jesus, but through their stories, God's desire to have a relationship with us. God's desire for us to get up close and personal with him. That's why Jesus came into this world, to show us God in human form, to show us the Father, to invite us to come to follow him. Our story may not be as dramatic, as emotional. Our story may never get told to millions upon millions of people. But God cares no less for you. He's no less personal for us. And let's rest and trust in that.